Tau, more policy and planning. So warm welcome to you all, our first hui of the Policy and Planning Committee for 2026. Hopefully summer's arrived and we're all feeling a bit of vitamin D sinking in. Please ensure your microphones are on, whānau, and we have apologies today from Mayor Phil Nixon from STDC. We have Councillor Aaron Langton here present as his alternate. We also have apologies from Mitch. Time. Can I have a mover and a seconder that apologies be accepted? Thank you, Jonathan. Seconder. Thank you, Grant. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. We move to confirmation of the minutes from the 2nd of December. Any comments or discussion? Can I have a mover?
Benita, can I have a matters arising after the minutes were approved?
Kapai. Do you want to speak to it now, Tuhia?
Approve it first and I'll speak to it after.
Okay, Kapai. Can we have a mover and a seconder for those?
Happy to move.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Craig. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Tuhia?
Yeah, thank you. I just noticed in the minute, the agenda pack today, we don't have an update on the freshwater kaupapa because of what's happening within government. I was just curious to get an update on how communications are going with our iwi potaio, given that that matter's not moving much at the moment. Is there a new sort of process in place to just keep those comms going?
So through you, Madam Chair, we're currently trying to organise a meeting. Anne's nodding. Yeah, that's what we're currently in the process of doing.
Organising a hui ASAP.
Oh, cool. Kia
ora. Before we move into the agenda, we are all aware of the draft decision that's been released by the panel assessing the TTR fast track application. So I think it's prudent that we get a bit of an update from Steve and Finbar as to what that means, where that's at, and next steps for council, if any. Hand it over to the meeting. Thank you.
Kia ora. To you, Chair. Thank you. Yes, so you'll be aware the draft decision was issued by the panel last week. That draft decision is to decline the application. At this stage, emphasising that is a draft decision still, so it's not appropriate to comment on the substance of it. But I'll just outline some of the key matters of those outlined in that decision, and then just talk briefly on what the process is from here. So the panel found that it would have significant regional benefits and some national benefits, but they found that the adverse impacts are sufficiently significant to be out of proportion to the regional or national benefits, and so they exercise their discretionary power to decline the application. It is a long list of reasons for declining the application. Along with the executive summary, I'd direct you to, there's a really handy table in the appendices of the decision which provides a breakdown of all the matters both for and against the application and how much weight the panel gave to them. So matters that weighed heavily on the panel in terms of their decision to decline was around the uncertainty to do with the sediment plume and the effects on a range of marine biota. They found that granting the consent would result in material harm to benthic primary productivity and benthic ecosystems, such as the important reefs out there that we have scheduled in our plan. That material harm is likely to Maui dolphins, and there's credible risk to other important marine species like the little penguin and the fairy prion, and a range of other effects around potential effects on fisheries. And a significant portion of the decision was focused on the adverse impacts on existing interests, particularly those of tangata whenua and their tikanga-based relationships with the moana and its resources, and Māori commercial and customary fishing interests. And also, what you might have seen in the news, another issue was the potential impact on the Kupe wellhead platform due to the risk of instability from the mine tailings. And interesting, at least for a nerd like me, is that along with declining it under their discretionary power, the panel in their draft decision states that actually the application triggers one of the limited grounds in the Act for when an application must be declined, and that is due to inconsistency with treaty settlements due to customary and commercial fishery rights. So that's an overview of the application. In terms of next steps, the applicant currently has until the 19th of February to comment on the draft decision and suggest changes. And the Ministers for Māori Development and the Minister for Māori Crown Relations have until the 20th of February to provide their comment. After that, the panel will make any required amendments to their decision, and they're due to issue a final decision by 18th March. After that, any party can make let me rephrase that. If the draft decision is if the final decision is to decline, the applicant has the ability to appeal that on points of law, and any party who provided written comment, so that would include the likes of the local authorities, iwi, and also the likes of Greenpeace, can choose to become party to that appeal if it were to occur. And if the decision, so that's probably that would be a key next step. If they change their mind and the decision becomes to grant the application, then similarly parties could appeal that as well. But those appeal rights have been limited by a recent change to the Act, so the only parties that would preclude the likes of Greenpeace from appealing the decision, but iwi and local authorities still could if they so chose. And just to note that we will be providing a full report to probably the April Policy and Planning meeting, providing a bit more detail on the decision and also a bit of analysis where we think our contributions have been useful and taken into account in the panel, by the panel. Happy to take any questions.
Kia ora. Thank you, Finbar. Any questions or comments? Kapai. Thank you for that update. We will watch with interest over the next few weeks then. Okay, moving into item tab 5, simplifying local government reform submission. Again, that's you, Finbar, thanks. But just before we do, I'd just like to note some of the paragraphs and sections refer to the potential for work for the Local Government Commission to complete in our submission, and just noting my role there as a current commissioner, which is not a conflict at this stage, but just wanted that on record, please. Back to you, please, Finbar.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Just an opening comment, which applies to both this submission and the subsequent submission on resource management reform. In any submission process, but I think particularly for these two, there is also always a balancing act between principle and pragmatism in terms of saying what needs to be said, but also making suggestions that might actually get listened to. And as we've drafted these submissions, we've tried to balance that. We probably lean more towards the pragmatic view because that's where we will have the greatest chance to see changes to the bills which might improve outcomes for Taranaki and generally result in a better process. So just to talk to the simplifying local government submission, I'll keep this very brief. I'm sure you've all read it with great interest since it does somewhat affect you all. But the core proposal from the government is that that regional council laws would cease to become probably sometime mid next year, and the regional council laws would be replaced by the combined territory board comprised of a panel board of the three district mayors. And along with picking up interim running of regional council responsibilities, that board would have a responsibility over the preceding 2 years to produce a reorganisation plan for the region that basically does a whole lot of options analysis and puts forward a recommended option to how to restructure all of local government in Taranaki to achieve a range of objectives that the government will set and they outline. And the government has signalled that that legislation to do that won't be passed until after the election, but we could probably expect, in principle, cabinet decisions in the next few months on what they want to do, assuming they're re-elected. Our submission canvasses a range of points, the most salient ones being a call for, as much as possible, bipartisan agreement on this stuff, and a bit more of a detailed look at the wider system than is currently provided. I mean, if you're going to do local government reform, you want to do it properly, and it needs to be informed by quite robust information, and that process to be given enough time to do it, as I said, do it properly. Materially, our submission suggests that regional councillors should see out their term, so they would remain in office until the end of near the end of 2028, and that also a structure be provided for that CTB to basically start working on the reorganisation plan as soon as possible if a region so choose, to have that flexibility, and that the chair of the regional council also sit on that board to assist that process. The other parts we talk about in the submission is recommending that commissioners are an important part of that CTB. I think particularly for a region like Taranaki, where we're small, it is important, really important, that you get the right mix of skills around that CTB table for what will be delivering some, a lot of weight on their shoulders. And there's a lot for them to work through, and that should be provided. And also important to this is that the treaty settlements we have here in the region are appropriately carried forward into the new regime, particularly the iwi representation on this committee, for example. And in saying that, it's touched on, I think, in the discussion document, but there's an underlying assumption that while the CTB would be there at the top, you would still have a committee structure underneath that would be appropriately filled with more people than just the 3 years. And also, we've been thinking a bit more about this as well, and in those commissioners, some of the skills that you probably need to ensure represented is a really good understanding of tikanga and the treaty and its role in the region, so that is well represented on the CTB as well. And then one thing to note across all of this is that this process of developing these reorganisation plans is potentially quite expensive. You might have seen the article in the paper today about the turkeys having to vote for Christmas, but it seems particularly galling that the turkeys also have to pay, because the bill for that would likely fall on regional council. So our submission does suggest that if rates capping progresses, this work should be exempt from that. Otherwise, the ability for us to do a good job would be severely limited. I will leave it there. I might just pass it to check with Steve if I've missed anything, because there's quite a lot of matters covered within the submission. But then happy to take any questions.
Yeah, no, I think the other critical piece to this is the interactions between local government reform, RMA reform and rates capping. They are all proposed to happen over effectively the same time frame. And indeed in the Operations Committee this morning there was discussion about the increased workload with consent renewals being pushed out by a couple of years. That workload will also be occurring at the same time you're trying to implement the new natural and environment planning frameworks and spatial planning frameworks. So, and of course in the middle of all that time frame over the next 4 to 5 years, you've got another round of local government elections about 8 months before the reorganisation plan is due to be presented to and approved by a minister, roughly, and at about the same time as the spatial plan also needs to be approved. So the 28 to 31 councils under these timeframes proposed would be being asked to approve a spatial plan that's been partially developed by a previous administration, a reorganisation plan that's been partially approved by a previous administration, and cope with rates capping. And rates capping that even on the government estimates for implementation of RMA reform accounts for about a 2% increase. Emergency management reform is 1%, and you've got a whole bunch of other reforms also needed in the middle of there with new local water done well, continuing building control, new development levies, new infrastructure funding and finance act, new and obviously election processes, because the review process is just underway at the moment as well. So a whole raft of change is going to have to be managed, and indeed we will need to take into account and think about as we start preparing the 2027 plan, a long-term plan, which we really need to get done basically by Christmas this year. So there's some challenges in there that we're going to have to work through with you this year. So important to understand that bigger picture and why this isn't a simple restructuring process in its own. It's actually a much broader package of change that will need to be managed by these CTBs under the current proposal, and hence why the submission suggests it's really important, as well as the local political representation, you have skills that cover a number of the other areas involved with such a complex and significant, effectively system change that is fundamental to addressing a number of developmental challenges facing the country, particularly in the infrastructure space. So look, happy to take any other, as Findo said, happy to take any discussions, but really important we understand the complexity of what will need to be managed in the next 5 years.
Right, so we'll go to Tuhiao, and then Jonathan, and then over to Neil, and then Susan.
Yeah, kia ora koutou. Thanks for that, Steve and Fimba. So I emailed a response from the iwi Potaio yesterday, which hopefully you had a chance to read. Apologies, a bit late. The main request I think that we're seeking is an amendment to include comments around Māori seeking to have more of a position at the governance level. So not just in the committee level, but at the governance level, because we can't see that there's any. Well, yeah, the power balance is going to be against us at the committee level, and it's just hard to see what level of, I guess, power there is in those potential committees that we don't know about yet. So, yeah, if we could add a comment seeking every representation at the governance level alongside the mayors, that would be good. And the second point really is I've got a concern around the whole, if we've got the mayors and the district councils effectively governing their own resource consents moving forward, how is that conflict managed? Because I didn't see that in what I saw on the bill. So if you could comment on that, and maybe you could add an amendment about that if it's appropriate. Thanks.
I'm happy to have an initial go, Chair. In terms of the resource consenting issue, that's a very standard issue that district councils and regional councils manage themselves now. We probably not as often as some regional councils, but we periodically have to apply to ourselves for a resource consent to undertake an activity, as do district councils. So in those cases, it's very common to use a commissioner as the decision maker, particularly if there's a degree of sensitivity associated with it. So we create those internal barriers for managing those reconsenting processes, and that arrangement would continue going forward into a new structure, and indeed is obviously an issue that current unitary authorities manage all the time as well. So I don't see that as being a particular issue that needs to be picked up, given it's a common practice and a common expected standard in place already. And I don't know if Mr McClay wants to comment further on that issue.
You, Madam Chair, in terms of enforcement, that's delegated to the Chief Executive anyway. It's not a political decision. We report the outcome of that back to you. The decision itself is delegated to Steve.
In terms of the iwi representation issue, there are a couple of comments I'd make on that. Firstly, it seems to me there's a discussion that needs to occur between the Crown and iwi with settlements about how those settlements might be reflected in the new system going forward. And so I'm expecting the Crown will interact with iwi about those issues as part of the process going forward, which is appropriate. And then if to the extent it might affect our working relationship or the way we work, I imagine the Crown will come and talk to us about what they're proposing and if there are to be any changes in those arrangements as a result of those discussions. So that deals with how settlement legislation might get rolled over and recognise the new framework. Because it certainly seems to me there are a range of issues in there that need further discussion, and I've certainly made that view known to some of the Crown representatives who have been talking to me about these issues in the recent past. In terms of the broader issue of CTBs, you'll see the proposal in the paper is that the CTB would be given delegation and the right to appoint commissioners to cover a range of, build a comprehensive set of skills, as we've also noted in there, and as Mr Kittle also commented in his opening comments, there's clearly a need for a clear understanding of local tikanga and treaty settlements and how those issues might be recognised locally. So that's the way in which we've seen those sorts of options being canvassed and considered as part of that process through that commissioner option, if it if the Crown was to agree to give the CTBs the powers to appoint commissioners to sit alongside and work with them. Now, if the Crown doesn't go down that pathway, then there is nothing obviously stopping the CTB, and it will actually be the Regional Council, because Regional Council under the proposal ends up servicing the CTB, would just employ, get the appropriate advice up into the CTB to ensure they're informed on those issues. So again, I'd imagine have a very practical working relationship with both the PSGEs and etc. throughout this whole process.
Thank you for that. Can I just ask Dion and Benita, are we happy to just leave it up for the iwi to make a comment, or would we like the council to make a further comment, as the Potaia asked?
Yeah, sorry, just to expand a bit on Tuia's kōrero. So one of the things that concerns us is the loss of subsidiarity, which is a key part of our RMA at the moment. So decision making should be made at the lowest level nearest to the impacts of the environment. Iwi have worked very hard in the last decade, especially on the relationship with regional council as the main environmental regulator. So any loss of that ability of local communities to impact the decisions that are made is very concerning. There's centralisation of decision-making power, which this draft proposal is looking at, but there's also centralisation of revenue, which flows through into the two bills as well, extracting revenue from council's activities and getting levies on permanent activities and consents and permits. So those two things, there needs to be a balance between that centralisation and maintaining subsidiarity at the local level. So those are definitely some of the key concerns of the just to Steve's point around the treaty settlements, so it specifically says in those treaty settlements that any changes will be dealt with by the CEs of the PSGs, three main PSGs, and the CE of the regional council. So the Crown should not have too much involvement in that. It should be a single-term relationship between the PSGs who define those provisions and the CEs.
Through you Chair, I guess part of my, and look, I'm happy to sit down with those three CEs and discuss this further, but it seems to me some of the proposals, particularly in the resource management reform space, go right to the heart of those treaty settlement documents, and they go beyond what I would have as a mandate as a council CE to resolve that. To me, some of those changes potentially go to the heart of the treaty settlements and what was implicit in the arrangements that were put in place. So it may well be that I should sit down with those three CEs and have a further discussion on that to make sure there's a common view on that. Because as I said, and certainly I've expressed this view to Crown officials. To me, you need, and they were accepting of that, of my view, that there does need to be discussion with the iwi in relation to, particularly in the resource management area. There's a fundamental shift away from this council to a much higher level, including, I would argue, the Crown itself, taking over some of the functions that this council has done in the past. Now, if iwi don't agree with that view, perspective, then kapai, not my role to disagree with them, but very happy to sit down with those three and have that discussion about what does it mean and what do they wish to pursue that further with the Crown.
Yeah,
That would be good.
So this connects with two bills as well later on to speak to.
Just a further clarification around some of those comments, Stephen Finbar. When we talk about potentially CTBs having the power to co-opt commissioners or appoint commissioners, what are the criteria for those commissioners? Are they current RMA commissioners, or how will the commissioners be appointed? And my other question is, Steve, talking to those Crown officials, so they actually now know that Taranaki has a specific requirement to sit at governance table level. In the past, as I understand it, they didn't realise that our council had those specific provisions with our iwi, and there was a lot of assumption going on that when they were talking about council Māori relations, it was agreed joint management memorandums of understanding, things like that. It wasn't sitting at the governance level. So do we have some confidence now that they understand that this is a fundamental treaty right that has been granted to iwi to sit at governance level, which technically will no longer exist when we remove it?
And just further to that, Chair, if I may, that was absolutely obvious when we sat down with the DIA and discussed it. It was like it was a surprise to them. Oh, really? Oh, yeah, I'll take that back to the Minister.
Yeah. So maybe we need to elevate those points more strongly in the submission.
Yeah, we can certainly strengthen some of those aspects in the submission. As I said, I've got email correspondence with the relevant Crown officials that we're supposed to be dealing with it. And I understood we're going to initiate the discussions with Taranaki iwi CEs, so I'll follow up with where that process has got to.
Kia ora. Ka pai, Tuhia, happy with that?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Kia ora. Thanks, Te Ia. So next on our questions list, Jonathan.
Just on that one, sorry, if we are going to make slight amendments, when we're talking about the CTB being able to appoint commissioners itself, could we add, for example, with expertise in Te Ao Māori? I think that would satisfy everybody.
Through you, Chair. So we've got in paragraph 37 of the submission, we talk about basically a skills matrix for what should be on the CTB. Currently that refers to sound understanding of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, but I think we should expand upon that. I'd recommend that we expand on that to be more specific around Taranaki specific tikanga and treaty arrangements, rather than just being a general, I know about the treaty from...
Yes.
Let's do that.
Or appointing a commissioner from outside the rohi.
Yeah.
Ka pai.
So we can modify 37 to, I think, reflect that.
Thank you.
Kia ora. Ka pai. Sorry, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for the work you've done in preparing this submission. I like where you have landed it very much. Going back to the actual, I guess, subheading of the whole proposal from the government, making local government simpler, clearer and more cost effective for all New Zealanders. My question in terms of that centralisation effect, are you satisfied in your engagements with government that there is flexibility for us to be locally responsive, knowing that a lot of decisions, national policy statements, etc., will come from central government? Are we emphasising, as it's been mentioned, Taranaki tikanga, Taranaki economic pressures that we're facing, so that we don't end up with or that we can speak into the development of a system that is going to enable us to actually find net benefits for Taranaki, knowing that we are already a very efficient regional council. Have you identified risks to us through this process?
Yes, there are significant risks to us through this process. Underlying a big part of what this government is doing generally, and more specifically in our resource management legislation, there's a very strong theme to national standards and a nationalised approach. Emergency management's another one again, which has had a drift over a prolonged period of time across multiple administrations for greater national consistency. And to be fair, we, through the likes of Te Reo Kahika, have been saying greater standardisation of processes and of policies to the extent where they are relevant, while allowing for local flexibility, is a good thing to do. Sharing good practice and knowledge and having commonly agreed standards to which we all aspire is a good thing to do. We need to understand the full extent to which we will lose that local decision-making ability, particularly in the resource management space, which is obviously a prime piece of legislation for us. We need to really see the new national direction, and I'm sure Finbar will discuss this further when they get to the next item on the agenda, is that greater setting of national standards and consistency could well limit us. But that's
that's the reality of the policy environment in which we're working. Now, will we still have enough local flexibility? I would hope so. But we need to see the next level of detail to really be able to answer that question. And certainly at the moment, I think we're generally comfortable.
Yeah, through you, Chair, just to add on that, when you compare these two different proposals, they are a bit different in that approach. The resource management bills are very much centralisation focused, right, in terms of more national, stronger direction, and then, but we will still have discretion to do what we need to do here in Taranaki. The local government proposal is somewhat the opposite. It's sort it out yourselves. And that's what the reorganisation plan is essentially about, right? The government will set some high-level parameters for what it needs to achieve, and they'll do this review of regional functions, which we suggest should be extended to all TAs, and they might go, oh no, we're actually going to take this off you and centralise it. So we'll get that direction, I think. I can't remember what the timeline for that, so they're doing like a rapid review of the regional council functions now, right?
Early next year, I think.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But yeah, I think my feeling personally, at least from the simplifying local government proposal, is it is very much find a locally led solution, and we'll set some parameters, but resource management is kind of flips it probably. Thank you.
Neil.
Madam Chair, just let me say, start with, I'd like to thank Finbar and Steve for what I might call shining a torch into the dark cave that's ahead of us. And really, it's very difficult to see exactly what's going to happen. It's all really just guesswork at this stage. One matter that isn't really in the submission, but is the practicality of the fact that the mayors are going to be such a significant role in this. They're going to be asked, they're already obviously doing their jobs as mayors in the various district councils. They're going to be asked to more or less double up their activities by coming in here. And a lot of those, to be honest about it, are not people who really studied or understand or been involved in regional council or these EU matters at that level and those kind of things. So is it practical in many ways? I know this is hard to answer. Is it realistic to expect that they will be able to seamlessly do this? The second part, I guess, is also something that's been slightly canvassed here, which is the commissioners' aspect. So if the mayors are, and it may be because just the numbers of people required, committees and all those things would take on commissioners. Now, Taranaki's fine in the sense that it was just us doing it, but it could well be going to be every regional council. So is there a sort of persons around who to meet those kind of criteria to do what you want them to do? Is that practical? I mean, we've had experience in the past about looking for commissioners for hearings, for resource consent and so forth. And the truth of the matter is, we had a relatively small pool of people out there who could do the job, and indeed, it isn't just a matter of picking anybody. If you want a good job, you've got to pick the specialist. So are we going to have they thought about the situation in which you've got somebody or other, or people who are more or less on a whole series of different regional councils around the country doing their thing? I'm just a bit troubled that what you've written so far is fine, and there's no criticism of it, except to say, are we emphasising the practicality of this actually working like this?
Through you, Chair, we do touch on in the submission the capacity issue with regards to the mayors, particularly in a small region like this. They are only human and there are only so many hours in the day, and these are big organisations with complicated issues to deal with. And hence the recommendation in our submission that the chair of the regional council be appointed to the CTB, and even if the regional councils do disappear from mid-2027, that the option is available for the CTB to appoint the former chair as a commissioner to kind of provide that skills overview. And generally the commissioner idea in itself is to help alleviate some of that burden. With regards to the issue of how many commissioners are there in the country to deal with this stuff, that's a good question, and it's a point that we raise in the resource management submission in terms of staffing the panels to make decisions. I think you're probably talking a slightly difference in numbers there. Like you're only talking probably 1 or 2 commissioners for the whole of the regional council, and if one of those needs to be very focused on, like, you know, Taranaki tikanga, then that's someone from, by definition, Taranaki pretty much. And then the other thing to note, and this is only touched on a little bit in the discussion document, but I don't want to read into it too much, but at least my working assumption, because I don't see how else you could do it, is that you've got the CTB, and then you've got a committee structure underneath that, and that has district councillors in part appointed to those committees as well. So for example, the CTB, hypothetical situation where regional councillors do disappear, so I'm trying to find polite ways to say it, that's the best I come up with. Around mid next year, and the CTB comes in, and you've probably still got a policy and planning committee that makes recommendations to the CTB, but the composition of that policy and planning committee would look very different. You would have more district councillors, you'd still have the iwi reps, and you might have a couple of former regional councillors appointed to that committee, and that's just the kind of stuff we'd have to work through for what works for us, I suppose.
And those options are contemplated in the discussion document. They talk about district councillors, of which there are 40 odd across the region. So we might need, well, even if we needed 11 of them, that's only 25% of them picking up one committee. So if you look at it in that perspective, you could actually, you should be able to find 25% of them prepared to pick up another committee's workload.
What we haven't noted, what has been noted in some of the other ones, is what about democracy? I mean, they were not elected by their communities to represent the region, to work on the regional council. The regional councillors they have different skill sets, and they have obviously been put in place to do different jobs. So we could put something in there about local democracy.
Yeah. And that would, sorry, through the chair, that would strengthen the point around regional councillors continuing their term.
Yeah. Exactly. I think we could emphasise that point a little bit stronger. I did note that in some of the other submissions coming from around the Monte.
Thank you. Okay, back to our list, Susan.
I just wanted to commend you for the submission. I think it balances pragmatism and the requirements of central government really well. I do question whether there's a mechanism that would allow appointments other than commissioners as such to the CTB or CPT or whichever way around they go. Because I think that we hamstring ourselves if they have to be formal commissioners, because they are as rare as rocking horse poo in an environment such as this. And there's real value in having people from the province with the necessary skills, but without that title as appointees.
Hence my question, who are the commissioners? Are they RMA commissioners? Are they freshwater commissioners? Are they, you know,
well, they will be
commissioners?
I mean, to be a commissioner in the RMA sense generally, as you well know, requires appointment from DIA and what have you. And I imagine you've got a warrant from the Governor General to be a commissioner, have you?
No, you just have to pass the course, which is onerous. But that's my question. Is it RMA commissioners? So how do we define commissioners?
You could talk to appointed members of the CTB rather than.
Well, I just think the word commissioner is unhelpful because it funnels into an expectation that doesn't necessarily serve us well, and is quite limiting.
Yeah, could be quite limiting from a representation point of view, right?
Yeah, yes, it could well be, because our commitment has to be to the environment first and the province second. So what's the best for those things? And surely we are best placed to make those judgments, given the level of competence that exists within the province anyway. So I'm not altogether convinced that the use of commissioners serves anybody particularly well, and I think the point made by Neil about their relative rarity And the fact that they would be spread very thinly, over all of the regional councils going through this process seems unhelpful.
Just to take that a step further, I think when the discussion document or the options coming from the minister or the proposal talked about commissioners, I think they probably had a certain type of commissioner in mind. One that would potentially be appointed by the minister himself.
Which again,
which is not the type of commissioners that we're talking about here in this forum.
So look, if the government pick up on this proposal, we'll see it again in the bill and be able to comment, so we could refine the terminology there. It was a pragmatic way of, it's the same language as what government have been using, it's the language they use at the moment. There have been a number of councils that have been managed by commissioners in recent years. And so that process is well proven forward, and there's models here that allow it to work.
Yes, but I don't think we necessarily need that level of person, do we?
Well,
it's a label rather than a definition. It's a label. So those who have been appointed to oversee operations and councils haven't been RMA commissioners. They've just been commissioners for their work, right?
but this isn't the RMA.
No, that's right. That's what I mean.
This is overseeing a complex change process across multiple pieces of legislation. So it's a big piece about how do you lead what will be not just, you're talking 4 councils in Taranaki's case. You're probably talking $6 or $7 billion of public assets and $400 or $500 million turnover. So a scale that, with all due respect to current elected members across Taranaki, is significantly bigger than any of them are used to. And fundamentally changing, delivering new service delivery models that will bring your cost, deal with a massive infrastructure deficit and fund that within a rates cap of 2 to 4%, so which has proven to be over the last 15 years about a third lower than actual local government cost increases, and you've got to catch up a backlog, and you've got to cope with 3% reform change costs just on 2 of the pieces of change. This is really big, really big over 5 years. Hence why you stand right back and look at it that way. You actually need to identify a set of skills that is quite significant change happening in parallel across the country over 16 regions or 13 regions at least, if not 16.
Good point.
Could be a very rare skill set that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But you're not going to find one person who can do it all, though, are you?
Yeah, which is where the question of how many of these people exist
that's right.
is absolutely a very valid one. And again, I think we try to address this issue, but with the RMA piece, for example, about talking about extending the transition period and having different time frames for different regions. Some of those issues also need to be thought about across this reform program.
I mean, there are a colossal number of moving parts in this whole thing. And like reading your next submission kind of makes my head spin. Just imagining how you would keep in your own head this and this and this and the overlay and the interrelationship between all the bits is going to be a monumental task. And this is a once in several lifetime opportunity. I mean, the last local government revision was 89. This is much bigger, I think, because it's changing the statutory basis of everything that we're supposed to be doing at the same time as opposed to what it was in 89, which was compressing a bunch of councils into a smaller number of councils. This is much more than that. Much more than that. It's going to impact everything for generations to come, and we need to do it once and do it right.
Does anyone else got any comments? Anyone who isn't?
Just one last comment.
Can I just go to Lee?
I just extended that. Just go back to the point. You're asking the mayors to do this. They're not specialists, so they're coming in as
Yeah.
another group.
That point's been made, and the lack of public mandate for them to do the work as well, I think is fair comment. Lee?
Yeah, well, the only thing I sort of, hope that is covered, and I don't know if you might be able to sort of shed a bit of light. Are we confident the CTB covers that representation well enough for the full region? Like, yes, we've got our 3 mayors, but within that sector, are we?
Through you, Chair. Yeah. I think so this is where it kind of makes sense, and this is where you get into there's some complicated stuff in there about voting power, because it's not, you would not go, basically the government is trying to keep urban and rural constituencies happy. So the structure they have in there around voting power is that each mayor would have a certain amount of votes based on, you'd go through a process of based on population, but then also it would go through, was it the local government commission or someone else, it would go through a process of modulation where they might go, Stratford's mayor needs a few extra votes because even though they haven't got much population, it's a big land area. So their proposal is that you'd end up with that. And then they've added on another layer where they suggest, that's what you do for most of the decisions. But if you're making a resource management decision about your spatial plan, there's a different voting structure, which gives more weight, which you would have to pass both a proportional vote and a majority vote of the mayors, again to tip more of the balance towards rural constituencies. Gets super complicated. One of the points we make in our submission is, if you have commissioners or some other term, or appropriately vetted commissioner, that has voting rights, part of their job is to avoid any one council dominating, so you can hopefully avoid having such complicated voting structures, which just look like a nightmare, or look very complicated at least. So again, I think part of the reason for the commissioners is it acts as a check against any one council kind of overstepping their bounds of their proportion or something like that.
Certainly makes the plus or minus 10% rule look very, very easy, doesn't it? Any other comments anybody's got regarding the submission? Kia ora.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou. Just a couple of questions and then just a couple of comments too. So what you're saying is currently with these changes, there is no financial support from the government? Cool. In terms of the skill sets, has it been determined what qualifies as those particular skills to be a commissioner?
No. Well, their proposal is, and their preferred option is, it's just the mayors. So they're relying on democracy giving you the right skills and outcomes to lead this process. Albeit acknowledging Chair Craig's point about they weren't elected with a mandate to do that on behalf of the region. So no, and that's why again we had a go at trying to recognise some of the skills needed in the submission.
Ka pai. Because it was stated that there may be the opportunity for this existing councillors to stay for the full term, has there been any consideration to actually have elected members of the regional council pursue the opportunity to be a commissioner?
Well, that's partly contemplated by saying one of your options, if you allow it, is to deal with the issue of regional council chair or indeed other regional councillors being appointed as commissioners. Because even under this recommendation here, if they go out at 2028, at best, and they're not started, they're only going to be halfway through, as I said, 2/3 of the way through at best, through the reorganisation plan process, which would represent a loss of knowledge at quite a critical point, just when you're trying to pull the complete package of a reorganisation plan together, although only one of your members is gone. Hence why there needs to be that commissioner process again if the regional council chair is there, to keep them involved in the process until the plan is produced. So it's one of those timing sequencing issues again.
Okay, just finally, I suppose, just a comment. And an acknowledgement to the Taranaki Regional Council. There is a level of expertise that is here that I don't think there's the required capabilities and other councils, regardless of what anyone says. So just an acknowledgement for all your work, and I think if there are concerns here, they're shared. And I just want to make that note that there are some grave concerns about this, particularly the centralisation of how things are going. So as an advocate and representing the New Plymouth District Council, I think it's only fair to make comment that there is the opportunity to work in alignment. How that looks, I'm not too sure, but just wanted to acknowledge the Taranaki Regional Council for all your mate. So that's all.
Ngā mihi. I just had a couple of final things to query. The first is around repetition. Can we just make sure that we're repeating things throughout the submission? For example, in part 6, we talk about our preferred approach as the mayoral forum, and then we repeat the same statement in 38. So either, one place or the other, or in 38, include as previously stated, just to make sure that we're not repeating ourselves too often. The other question I had is around alternates. Are we going to comment at all on the potential for it not to be mayors who are sitting at the table, or if they want to appoint deputies? Is that appropriate for us to comment on, or not really? It's just something that came to me the other day.
Certainly the submission document contemplates the mayor's being able to send somebody else.
Yes.
I don't know whether that actually went as far as in terms of the CTB itself.
No, I don't think
I don't think it did. Because you wouldn't, it's a bit like, so you wouldn't necessarily want to change that person.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
CTB.
Are we going to comment on that that it be the mayor's, or is that nothing that
and suggesting
we should be worried?
So how would you appoint the elected member, elect the council, the district council identify which one of their members is going to be on the CTB?
Or just that we agree that it should be the mayors that are on the CTB?
Well, clearly they've chosen the mayor because they have won the democratic mandate for the district as a whole.
Yeah.
Hence by standing for the position.
Yeah. I mean, that was my question. Sorry, badly worded question.
Yeah.
But we support that position, so perhaps we should state that. Okay, any other comments?
Through you, Chair, can I just check that I've got all of the amendments
Please do.
sorted? So just adding explicit support for it being the mayor's and that core responsibility not being able to be delegated, but you have alternates if you can't make it. Remove that repetition. Add material kind of elevating the importance of the local treaty landscape here in Taranaki and setting that out in a bit more detail.
Mm-hmm.
Modifying that skills matrix to emphasise that local specific tikanga and treaty knowledge, Taranaki in this case. And adding a stronger point on maintaining democracy in terms of regional councillors have been elected for this function, other district councillors and mayors have not been. And so that sending out their term would maintain that kind of democratic representation. Was that everything?
Yep. So do we need to allow or delegate Steve to make the changes so it doesn't have to come back through again?
Yes. We can do that, Steve. That okay?
That's fine. Yep.
If everybody's happy with that, I have a mover for those recommendations. Thank you, Jonathan. Seconder Lee. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Kia ora, it's passed. Well done, team. That's a biggie. Okay, next on to the next gritty. Kaupapa. Planning Bill and Natural Environment Bill. Way to go, Finbar.
Through you, Chair, thank you. I will, again, you've heard me say this a few times, but I'll provide just an overview of the key changes in the bill, particularly emphasising where it impacts on the roles of regional council, and then I'll just highlight the key issues raised in our submission. You'll appreciate there is a lot of very technical detail in that submission. It's the nature of this process. But yes, so the structure that the government is proposing is that you'd have two bills, the planning bill, which essentially covers district council responsibilities, and the natural environment bill, which essentially covers regional council responsibilities. The planning bill also sets out requirements for a regional spatial plan, which would be developed collaboratively amongst all of the councils in the region. The the Natural Environment Bill has a very strong, the core focus is on the setting of limits for managing various environmental domains, think freshwater, coastal, indigenous biodiversity, air and soil. We're very familiar with what that looks like in the freshwater space, where we're currently in the NPSFM have to set targets, slightly different change in terminology and a bit of a philosophical change there from kind of more aspirational targets towards bottom lines. And the thing to note there is in terms of that setting of new environmental limits, it's actually a lot more work for regional councils. The scientific, we don't know what the detail looks like, but the government will be setting methodologies for how we determine environmental limits. So we'll have to do that for freshwater, and a good chunk of our existing work will be able to be modified to that. But we're also going to have to go through a similar process for the coastal environment, for indigenous biodiversity, potentially for air, but that might be set nationally, and for soil. And that potentially means a lot of work and not too much time for us. At the same time, we're also developing a spatial plan. So I think that's important to emphasise. The other big change in these bills is a shift away from what is called I think a prescriptive purpose statement. So the Resource Management Act at the moment has a purpose that says this is what this act sets out to achieve, and then kind of everything flows from that purpose. It's all about sustainable management and things like that. These bills have what they've termed a descriptive purpose statement, which just kind of say, yeah, these are the things these bills are going to manage. And it doesn't provide any kind of policy direction for how you do those things. And then the bills both have a really important section is the goals. So they set out a list of goals that each bill needs to achieve. And again, it doesn't provide much direction within the bills themselves on how you will reconcile the inevitable conflicts between those goals, like around enabling development or no net loss of biodiversity. I can't remember the exact goals. Currently under the Resource Management Act, how that's dealt with is there's like a hierarchy of different things. So some things are just said to be more important than others. How they propose to deal with those inconsistencies in these bills is the minister will decide. So they will use national direction to resolve conflicts amongst the bills and basically give councils their marching orders for what's more important than other things. Now, the submission raises that that approach itself risks the kind of policy instability we've seen with the National Policy Statement for Freshwater, because it sounds very alluring to the current minister to be able to set all that national direction, but all it takes is a change in government, and you could, in theory, see quite significant policy shifts that then make us have to change all our plans. So the submission, we kind of basically say, without getting into too much detail, there needs to be more checks and balances on how that system works so we don't get that policy whiplash every time the government changes. And so just on the plan structure, so your spatial plan, and then you would have a natural environment plan sitting underneath that, which is kind of the rules for how you manage freshwater and indigenous biodiversity. And then each district council would write a land use plan, which is your zoning, your setbacks from your neighbour's boundary and your shading rules. And and across this, as I said, there'll be more national direction. So we'll have these prescribed methodologies for how we define these limits, and we'll probably also get more prescriptive national environmental standards. So currently we have the national environmental standards for freshwater and commercial forestry, which basically just give you the rules that you have to consent. We expect those will probably be expanded upon. But the big change for national direction is the standardised zoning. So that's a big impact on TAs, district councils, where you would have seen the press releases, getting rid of the hundreds of current zones we have down to 13 or whatever. And I somewhat flippantly described this, but I saw it come up in an MFE press release, so I found vindicated. Land use planning at the district level kind of becomes paint by numbers, where you just go, we'll put this zone here, we'll put this zone here, and you have limited ability to change those zones. But you can if you jump through a bunch of costly hoops. So that's the policy stuff. In terms of consenting, the changes are, it's very similar to the current framework. They delete a couple of activity classifications, so non-compliant activities get removed, and those are horrendously complicated, so I don't think anyone's worried about that, and controlled activities. And you get a greater reliance on permitted activities, and particularly permitted activities that have crunchier standards attached to them. So you could write a permitted activity that says, you can do this without a consent, but you at least need to notify the council that you're doing it, so we can collect a bit of data on your bore, for example, if it doesn't need a consent, but we at least know where it is and how much water it's taking. And the other big change in for the consent stuff is that less public participation in the consent-making process. So the thresholds for notification for any consent get lifted, and they're continuing the practice they did at the last amendments to less hearings and things like that. And the rationale for that is you focus your public participation at the plan-making stage, get that right, so you don't have to worry too much about consenting and everything can happen faster. For compliance, the main changes are really just some more probably quite useful tools for us to use in compliance. Not covered in these bills is the proposal to centralise all enforcement functions. That will run through a separate process, but you do see we comment that in the submission saying recommending we do not support the boots on the ground aspect being delivered out of Wellington, but there would be a useful function for a national body that kind of just provided oversight and direction and set expectations for council delivered compliance. So that's the potted highlights of the bills. The issues raised in our submission, we've talked about this before, but the cost, these plans will have to be developed in a very short amount of time, and that will come with cost. And there's also significant cost potentially attached to regulatory takings, but I'll return to that later. There is a notable dilution of Māori interests and recognition of cultural matters of importance to tangata whenua in the bills, as in reference to cultural matters has been removed as a matter that matters, except for the identification of sites of significance to Māori. And you'll see our submission raises concerns about that, and also the potential inconsistencies that might raise with treaty settlements. Another thing that we talk about is, so the purpose of the Natural Environment Bill is around enabling the use, protection and enhancement of natural resources, but there's next to no reference to enhancement ever again in the bills. So we've made some targeted suggestions just to provide the ability that you can pursue enhancement, primarily in a non-regulatory way, but it's there still as an expectation on councils. There's a whole range of new legal tests. Some of that's unavoidable when you're doing new legislation, but some of it's just a bit silly where they've introduced a term when there's an established case law definition and they haven't used that, so we recommend that they do. And then another big step is the transition times in terms of this all happening quite fast, but at the same time acknowledging that fast can be good as long as it's not too fast. So we've made some very especially giving like 3 to 6 months more for that first spatial plan will be really important. And also including some protections in there, because there's some issues where the spatial plan has to have stuff in it that you don't decide until you've done your land use and environment plan. So your first spatial plan is always going to have gaps in it, so that they basically write some legal protections to say, it doesn't matter if your first spatial plan doesn't hit everything that it needs to, you can't be taken to court on that. And then you just revisit that soon after you've done your land use and environment plans. And then finally on regulatory takings, or regulatory relief as it's called. So this is the proposal where in the bills, if any council was putting certain rules in place, they would have to develop a framework for how they provide regulatory relief to the landowner. So it's important to note this isn't for everything, it's specified matters. So if you were to put a outstanding natural landscape layer on something, that would trigger the need to evaluate for regulatory relief. If you put a significant natural area, site of significance to Māori, built historic heritage, those matters you'd have to go through this process of going, okay, we've done that, how do we compensate the landowner for that? And in the bills, it sets out that you can compensate them in a number of ways: cash, money, preferential development rights, other things to like fencing and things like that, other mechanisms that you can support them. So there's a list that you'd work through. The government hasn't provided much more detail than that, because they just say, oh, and local government, write the actual framework yourselves as part of drafting your land use and environment plans in terms of the detail on how it will work in your region. And this creates some of the issues. So in terms of talking to the, sorry, I'm devoting a little bit more topic to this one because it's an interesting one and quite a complicated one. There's two main objections raised in the submissions around regulatory relief. One is a more philosophical argument and one's a more practical one. For the philosophical one, so the government has said, as they've been talking about this regime, they've said the whole purpose of it is to only manage externalities, which are basically when someone does something on their land that harms others, they should pay the costs of that harm, or they should be subject to regulation, which is a cost, to prevent that harm from occurring in the first place. So if you take that on face value and the regime only managed externalities, then in that case, there is nothing to compensate if someone has a significant natural area put on their property, because the person being regulated is simply being required to stop imposing costs on others. Does that kind of make sense? I know it's quite complicated, but the idea is essentially you're only meant to be managing costs. So if we pay regulatory relief, it is the ratepayer compensating someone who is doing something bad, which is an issue. Where it gets more complicated and is with things like significant natural areas, where it's harder to see how that's an externality. It's very clear to go, if you're putting a bunch of chemicals into a river, that is an externality that should be regulated. It's harder to see if you destroy that wetland on your property, that removes one of the few remaining habitat for a highly mobile bird, that then actually imposes a cost on everyone. So that gets more complicated. But that's the philosophical objection. If you're only regulating externalities, you don't need to pay regulatory relief. The more practical one is it's going to be really expensive, and how they've written the rules is, we don't know how expensive it will be. And how they've written the provisions is we have no ability to not regulate despite the cost of regulatory relief. So currently, there's a goal in there that says no net loss of Indigenous biodiversity, which you can quibble with in terms of being a low bar. But if that remains, that creates an obligation on us as a regional council to probably use significant natural areas as a tool to meet a target around how much Indigenous vegetation coverage you might have in your region. So we have an obligation to do that, and we have to do that before we have a framework for calculating the cost of regulatory relief. And even when we do know the cost, we can't necessarily go, oh, that will be too expensive, so we can't put an SNA on that property. So we risk running up in the situation where the central government, bear in mind, they're the ones who tell us we have to do these things. They tell us and set the expectations that flow down to us putting a bunch of SNAs on people's land. And then the ratepayer has to foot the bill for something central government has told us we have to do, which is where it gets problematic.
Within a rates cap.
Within a rates cap, and we may inherit a whole lot of existing SNAs, outstanding national landscapes.
That was my other question. Are they all grandfathered into this as well?
No, they're not.
Thank goodness.
So we may have to compensate those who already have them and have had them in the existing planning documents for the fact that 30 years ago, somebody in a district council or regional council decided that Mount Taranaki was a significant national landscape, and the farmer on the side of it should be compensated because it influences his farming activity, even though it's been there for 30 years.
And there are, sorry, final points. There's also significant practicalities on difficulties for how you would assess whether like an SNA or something like that impedes the use of land. So for example, we potentially would then have to do a bunch of LiDAR analysis to go, well, actually, no, that land is too steep to be productively used for this, and then figure out a system for developing all these calculations for how it would work in practice. And if the government had maybe provided some guidance on what that looked like, that would be useful, but they currently haven't. And so the submission says opposes regulatory relief, kind of at that more philosophical level and due to the practicalities. But then basically, because it'll probably still be in there, then actually just suggests a bunch of practical, more practical and pragmatic ways to improve the regime. So for example, that it recommends removing monetary as an option. So, because it seems like pretty legit, right? Like if you put, sorry, it seemed appropriate if you put an SNA on someone's property, you could argue that, yeah, we should be supporting them to maintain it, because that's how you actually realise biodiversity gains. And so if your regulatory relief framework was focused on that kind of stuff, really good. So some suggestions around that. And then the other two main changes is suggesting that you do not have to pay regulatory relief if that rule is necessary to achieving an environmental limit. So that deals with the issue of if the government says basically you have to whack down a bunch of SNAs to achieve this environmental limit, that we don't foot the bill for that. And then the final one is recommending that sites of significance to Māori are exempt from the regulatory takings regime, on the grounds that you're going to run into a whole lot of treaty issues with that in terms of how those sites are protected. And there's some other arguments in there on that matter as well in the submission that I can't recall off the top of my head. But sorry, that is more than enough on regulatory relief, but very happy to take any questions.
Kia ora from Grant and Craig.
Now, through you, Chair, firstly, well done. That was a beast of a thing to read and try and understand, and I still don't, to be fair. But just one thing, assumption, Steve touched on before about the assumption of cost for both of these things. What percentage do you see increase to the regional council? My second question, you keep talking about the rate capping and how the rate capping will affect it. The way I read the rate capping, will this all sit under the rate capping? Because certain stuff that's coming out, legislative stuff, wouldn't fall underneath it, so wouldn't fall into it. So could you just answer both them? So I know it's an assumption that you'd be saying, what cost will this be to the regional council? And secondly, would everything be falling under the rate capping?
We don't know what the cost will be because we haven't done the work to work out what's going to come across and exactly what would fall within the current drafting of the legislation. As Finbar says, we need to develop a framework ourselves.
Yep.
So we can't quantify that cost at the moment. But certainly practically, if you deal with things like landscapes, some of those tend to be relatively more high value land rather than lower value land. In terms of the rates cap applies to all, well, the rates cap proposal, as we understand it, applies to all local government activities other than local water done well, the three waters.
And so we'd require an exemption to take it out.
So these regulatory takings would fall within the rates cap. Within it, yes. Or we would have to go through the process of applying for a variation to the regulator to be able to put these things into our original plan, so, which is Finbar said would have a statutory obligation.
So I guess my question, Finbar, is it in here about that it shouldn't be sitting under the rate cap?
Yeah, I'd have to check. We've got it in the local government submission. I would suggest that if it isn't, we should put it in this one as well.
And I'm sorry if I've missed it, but
yeah, well, the rates capping is a separate process again.
I totally understand that, but it's well, my personal view, I think it probably should be. It shouldn't be stuck in the rate capping. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, look, my reaction is this government will put it underneath there, because they are shoving everything in there, including infrastructure deficits and all those sorts of issues, which is key part of the submissions is you're actually in danger of worsening the infrastructure deficit problem.
Absolutely.
So
and so if it is in there, it'd be great.
Through you, Chair, because we do have it in the other submission that the reorganisation proposal should be exempt from rates capping.
Yes.
So we could easily just, if it's not in this one, we could just say the same thing about this.
Sorry if I've missed it, but I've
Yeah.
never thought. Okay.
Good point, Craig. Thank you. So we'll go Craig, Tuhiao, and then Donna.
Just a,
You know, good.
yeah, me. Okay. Yeah, just a comment. This bill, as it's drafted, is quite the cluster. I have never, in 15 years that I've been sitting around this table, seen a draft bill come through from central government so poorly put together, so little understanding or engagement with the sector. I don't know who wrote it, I don't know how it was written, I know why it was written. We understand and we agree with the intent, but I've never seen anything quite like it, to be frank. And once again, huge gratitude to Finbar, Steve, and all of the staff who put together the submission. It is really impressive. I note there's 140 odd points that we are making. The vast majority in our submission are saying that doesn't work, that isn't practical, you have not thought about this aspect, you have not thought about that aspect. Clearly you should add this to it. So well done on the submission, I fully support it, and I just hope that the government is listening and that they will take into consideration all the submissions that they receive and all the points that we have made within. That is my hope.
Really, Craig. Tuhiao?
Yeah, kia ora. Yeah, just echoing those sentiments. What a mess, but what a good achievement to try and respond. Yeah, I support the submission. Just a few things, little tweaks maybe, is on page 19 and 20 of the table, which is page 89, 90 of the board pack. Just if so, sorry, just go to page 19. There's a point there in the recommendations that says iwi authorities be added to the definition of public authority in bill. Just wondering if we could actually highlight that in the previous written section so it stands out more. And then the second one is on the page 20, there's 3 comments, but there's no recommendations. And I just wondered if you could pull out sort of the last sentence generally of those 3 to make a recommendation, because I can just imagine the staff going through this and probably just focus on the recommendations. Because if they're not there, they might miss it. So that's all, thank you.
Are the recommendations you're looking for, Tuhiao, are they not the ones that are listed on page 89? Is it all part of the same section, or is it a whole different? It's just the way it's been tabulated and gone to a new page. Is that what it is, Finbar? You see what I'm trying to say?
Through you, Chair, yes. Yes, that's correct. So those 3 points around like identified Māori land and same or equivalent effect, the recommendations are on the previous page, yeah. So it's just split over the 2 rows.
Sorry, my bad. Thank you.
No. That's good. Donna.
I was just back to that regulatory relief and Finbar's explaining it. But I just really, you talk about a cost to all ratepayers, but it is a cost to one ratepayer, isn't it? And so it's really about sharing that. And I see as we evolve to catchment plans, and where there may be in some instances where 2 farms are set with, say, a wetland that will really make a difference to the environmental outcome, and that those 2 farms shouldn't bear the cost for the whole cost of the for the benefits of the whole catchment, because it's just sheer unlucky where they are. And so I don't see that should be a cost to that ratepayer. It should be a cost to all those ratepayers.
Through you, Chair, and I think there's a differentiation between So for something like that, there's the differentiation between the opportunity cost, right? So that land is currently undeveloped, but there is an opportunity to develop opportunity cost if that could have been
Well, it may
put
be
into
developed,
productive.
but it may go into something else.
Yeah. There's an opportunity cost at the moment. So you purchase the land with a wetland on it, and so currently that's not productive land, but keeping it as a wetland is an opportunity cost because you could put it into pasture, and that's true. But if you were to put it into pasture, the removal of that wetland has costs on others, and so the point of the regime is that you're regulating the cost that puts on others.
But that's assuming it's a natural wetland, and you're not talking about a constructive wetland or some other.
Yes, and those should just be. Well, my personal view is that's a different issue. Like if it's a constructed wetland or an induced wetland, that is a different matter, and that probably shouldn't they should be treated separately. And in that circumstance, yes, I think it would be appropriate, but it should probably be. I can't remember how they're dealt with under the Act, but like currently a constructed wetland, we can't schedule as a wetland. It doesn't meet the definition of an natural inland wetland, so it's its own thing.
So the definitions are there.
Well, that's a definition that's in the National Policy Statement for Freshwater, I think. But yeah, so something like that is different, should be treated differently, I would agree, for a constructed wetland.
Do we put that in now?
Well, currently, actually, I think, I'd have to go back and check this, but I think wetlands writ large and not actually...
It could be some other, it could be a sediment, it could be something that has a benefit to the whole catchment.
Yeah, we could definitely raise the issue, because we've talked about it in previous submissions around constructed wetlands and induced wetlands and how they're managed. So we could pull, I think we talked about that.
Yeah, they're in a different category to a natural feature.
Yeah.
Because, and if you stand right back from this particular regulatory taking piece, you get up to a point where you actually very quickly go to a point in which, as a society, we have a whole lot of rules imposed on us that at the individual level have a cost to us. But it's actually part of our cost of being able to live in a society. And we need structures to enable that to happen. So by imposing a bunch of rules, they limit in some way the things we can do as well as what we find acceptable, obviously, which is the democratic process. So actually, where those boundaries get drawn is ultimately a decision for the Parliament, but that is because if you look at the current RMA, things like natural features, SNAs, wetlands, a whole bunch of things, and a whole bunch of rules we impose on people about what they can build, where they can live, the types of activities they can undertake, there is no compensation. But ultimately, those sets of rules limit what people can do on their land and come at a cost to the individuals as well as to society if we don't have those set of rules.
So how is that different?
So that fits. This is a subset again of the government is proposing to move away under the RMA. It has been, there is no compensation, no matter what, for a rule created nationally, regionally, locally. So a district council classifies something as an outstanding natural feature or a special area of significance, they cannot seek compensation. Same as
a protected tree.
A protected tree, yes, exactly, a protected tree. And indeed, councils often debate about, have rules about how many trees can you cut down in a year, for example, as one council I work for had that, and which creates real issues for farmers trying to put fence lines up through a piece of native bush.
I guess it's about incentivising people to do these, being able to incentivise.
So that's a different issue to what this is, though, about. And absolutely, and obviously that goes to the heart of the sorts of things we do with land management, for example, with riparian plans and hill country plans and all the rest of it, and where we try voluntary but offer some resource, some public resource to help the farmers improve their practices and deliver environmental benefit. So this is a rule, though, where the government's saying we're going to shift the rules So rather than being free to impose rules, there's going to be a cost. And this is about in what circumstances should the ratepayer purse pay for a regional restriction.
Through you, Chair. So I think I'd need to go back and look through for our submission. So in our submission, we make the point I mentioned earlier that the National Environment Bill doesn't provide welfare enhancement, where you're kind of proactively doing something above what the limit would require of you. And there's also a tool in there around action plans, which are pretty half-baked in terms of what's in there at the moment. But I wonder, I'd have to go back and review, but there might be some language we could suggest including within that action plan framework, which would capture things like getting out there and supporting people to construct wetlands.
Because that's what we want.
Yeah, I think there's space for us to probably emphasise more that within the action plan framework. I'd need to go back and confirm. But yeah, and it also at the very least making the point that for things like constructed wetlands, as it is now, it's important that they're not captured by rules like the definition of a natural inland wetland, because if you do that, no one would ever construct a wetland again, right? So you have this perverse incentive, you would create a perverse incentive.
That might be a way to improve biodiversity as well, mightn't it? Hey, but Finbar, I forgot to say thank you for the work you've done in Steve. That was really great. And great for the explanations too. Because I've been hassling a bit about that one. Thank you.
Leadham.
Thank you, Vanita, through you, Madam Chair. I just had a question around your first comment far earlier around balancing principles with pragmatism. And when I read this from a federated farmer's point of view, some of the principles in this kind of need projecting on the outset, including the idea of environmental limits. Like, we're quite concerned that a change to environmental limits will actually make things worse and more difficult in the environment to be able to make plans and such. So I guess my question is that we have this submission and you've agreed, that we're going to agree with the principles and then take a pragmatic approach to try and fix them. But is there also a concern amongst council staff that the idea of environmental limits could actually make it harder to write rules that mean that it's easier for people to be able to use the land and for us actually be able to have a reasonable economy?
Through you, Chair. A lot depends on what the methodology for these environmental limits, how that will be set, and that will be done within national direction. From the discussions we've had internally, I don't really know how you really manage things like freshwater without environmental limits, which essentially says if you put this much nitrogen into the stream, all the fish will die. That's been very dramatic, I know, but that's the concept of the national bottom lines that we already have in the NPSFM, that if you breach these things, there will be severe ecosystem consequences that will then mean the water is at risk of poisoning your stock if they drink it, or it will not be fit for human consumption. And so you set these limits in a way that protects a bit both the ecosystem and people's ability to use the water. So the concept of environmental limits, I think we support. The question will be, what does that methodology look like, right? Because the methodology will point to where those limits will have to be set. And it will be where those limits are set that has the flow-on implications to everything else, and how you find that balance between setting an environmental limit that protects the ecosystem but doesn't put everyone out of business. And we won't see that, and we won't know the answer to that until we see the methodology. But also this system moves more towards, kind of like the current one, ultimately it would still be the responsibility of the regional council using that methodology to set that limit. So we would have the ability, our job would be to strike that balance to find what works for Taranaki. So philosophically, we support, the submission supports environmental limits as an effective tool, but noting there's a lot of detail still to come, like there are with many aspects of these bills.
And these limits take you potentially to land use controls, which if you look at the Otago Regional Council versus Federated Farmers there, the farmers hated that. So, but you can't have it both ways, right? We've had long-term degradation, and a little bit of degradation on each farm adds up to a lot of degradation, as we have with cities. So it's a call for action rather than, right? So we've got to get the balance right.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. I'm certainly not proposing that we have no rules. It was just a concern that the change in method, that what does the methods look like? And as you've already spoken, the concern that you're agreeing to something that you don't, in the end, we don't really know what it looks like. And that's just concerning when you don't know. And as Craig said, a very poor piece of legislation that is very, very difficult to come to some kind of balance around. And yeah, you have done a great job on the part of our entire community. So thank you.
I hope the feds, local feds and nationally, are putting in their own
certainly
strongly worded submissions as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Back to Donna.
Just two other things. One was around climate change and the spatial plan. I think that's quite a difficult one in that where we are with, I know for agriculture, they're doing some quite big research that will probably change what our emissions are. And so the research is still happening into mitigation options. And so I just think it's quite early to talk about, to put a spatial plan around climate change, if you get what I mean.
Through you, Chair, so climate change doesn't feature too strongly in terms of the mandatory matters. The only mandatory matter for climate change in the spatial plan, and it's quite a significant one, is that you would need to identify communities in need of detailed adaptation planning. So the framework for that will be set in a different piece of legislation, which I think should be introduced to the House sometime soon under the Climate Adaptation Act. So in drafting your spatial plan, you basically go through a process of going, oh yeah, Waikara's in trouble, in terms of communities that we kind of all know are more exposed to climate change risks. But you do a fair and impartial assessment across the region, and then you would identify those places, and then it would be the job of the relevant district council to do a detailed adaptation plan for that community. Where things like mitigation come into the spatial plan, under this government, it's very clear. I would expect that we're not going to be regulating greenhouse gas emissions or anything like that. The more useful questions for a spatial plan is how can it support activities that support emissions reduction? Like the obvious one is renewable energy, right? So how can you use your spatial plan to identify and incentivise renewable energy development in the right places to cut down your emissions that way? Not like getting into the nitty gritty of actually like regulating the gases themselves.
Cool. Okay.
Sorry.
Just one more. The other one was just a real worry for some people that, and these are non-agricultural. I was talking to someone this morning where he's gone through a really long process to get a consent, and now someone, with new legislation, that someone in the same industry might come in with a lot less conditions, and how we can kind of help them all come on an even playing field, if you like.
Because there's nothing that would stop a consent applicant apply, even though they may have a consent for another 20 years. They can come in tomorrow and apply for a new consent or apply for a variation. Same rules would continue to apply.
I just think there's some quite, it's not cheap to do that. And
so you're suggesting council should subsidise that?
No, I'm not, and I don't have an answer for it, Steve. I just think we should be aware of it.
So the answer is a very pragmatic one in my view, is if there's savings and benefits to the applicant seeking a variation or applying for a new consent under the new rules, they will do that very quickly. Yeah. In practice, they will just get on and do it. I see it all the time, applicants doing that.
And through you, Chair, there might be situations as well where through this process, something that is consented is no longer needs a resource consent.
Yeah.
So in that case, everyone would.
They would what?
They would just not need that consent anymore, right? So some of these things, if
Oh,
they
so it could be just.
yeah, yeah.
Thank
Pending
you.
much detail still to come.
That was all I had. Sorry.
Dion, and if Dion's the last, anyone else got any comment? We'll hand it to Dee for the last comment.
Good. Yeah, thanks for just given the amount of concern there from the EB, especially around the redefinition and reinterpretation of treaty rights and treaty principles. Are the recommendations page 19 strong enough, do you think? I know that the expert advisory group recommended the transfer of Section 8 from Mario Maker to rebuilds. That obviously hasn't happened. What's there now on the clauses 8 and 9 and 10 are not treaty principle clauses.
Through you, Chair, so what's being referred to at the moment is, so currently in the RMA there's Section 8, which is a prescriptive treaty clause, which says take into account. And so that's a matter that all your decision making kind of has to take that into account. The government has indicated a very strong preference to no longer use those clauses and instead utilising a descriptive treaty clause, which basically just sets out, and here are all the ways in the bill that we give effect to our Treaty of Waitangi obligations. And yeah, it would be a matter for the Council on whether you wanted to submit on that prescriptive treaty clause being carried over. To be blunt, if it's under this current government, it won't be, because they've passed other legislation that does not utilise that framework.
Shouldn't prevent us from continuing to ask, though,
No.
and push and advocate. Keep pushing the issue.
Happy with that.
Yeah, come on.
Great.
So we're adding
Carry over, yeah,
Carry
Section
over.
8 carries over.
happy kapai D. I just have one final question around the tone of the submission. I'm assuming it's the same kind of tone that we're seeing throughout Te Uru Kahika? Same kind of messaging they'll be getting from everybody?
Through you, Chair, yes, we've reviewed the Te Uru Kahika submission and they're very similar in terms of overall tone. And just on that point, sorry if you forgive the indulgence, I just want to say a big thank you as well to all the staff and also the staff and the TAs. So we've worked very closely with the 4 councils on this submission. So all of the councils kind of have a core common submission that we've then taken through our governance processes. But it's been a great process, and for most of it, I was swanning around in Nelson, Tasman anyway. So credit to them, and also and assisted by Government Quilliam as well, who really helped to pull it together in a short amount of time.
Awesome. Thanks, team. Please pass on our genuine gratitude to all of those who've been involved in the development of both of these submissions. A huge amount of work across multiple departments and all councils and GQ as well. Please pass on our thanks to them. Denny, if you can take those thanks back to your New Plymouth team, likewise you, Aaron, and Grant, if we can let them know to take those thanks directly back to not only governance but staff at all those councils as well who pulled together a significant amount of work. We all know, whānau, that this is just our wish list. This is our ideal world submission. There's absolutely no guarantees, but I'm personally proud of the work that's gone into that and hope that some of our messaging lands correctly.
Yeah.
Kapai.
Thank you, Bunny. Can we just delegate Steve to finalise that submission on our behalf, noting then
Sure.
all of the points that were made?
Yep. Everybody okay with that?
Yep.
Yes.
Do we need to still do the recommendations? We're delegating Steve to make those tweaks. Okay, can I have a mover and a seconder?
I'm happy to move.
Thank you, Susan. Seconder? Thank you. Mr Maxwell, all in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Any against? That's carried. Okay. We'll move to closing karakia. Kia uru mai, ahau ora, ahau kaha, ahau maia, ki runga, ki raro, ki roto, ki waho, rire rire hau, hai marire. And karakia for the kai, and you go and have lunch too, you ladies online. No mai i ngā hua,